Oyez, oyez, oyez. The Honorable, the Eastern High Court for the Kingdom of Denmark is now in session. The cause to be heard is in the matter of the Crown versus Prince Hamlet. Please give your respectful attention and kindly be seated.
The record should show that the jurors have been impaneled and are seated. The counsel for the defense and prosecution are present and are ready to proceed. Mr. Bailiff, will you please escort the defendant to his place in the courtroom? You are Lord Hamlet, Prince of Denmark?
Yes, my lord.
Please be seated. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Counsel are present, and I will please, it would be my pleasure if they would introduce themselves. Counsel for the prosecution.
I'm Chris Argatis, and I represent the people of Denmark.
My name is Miles Ehrlich. I represent the Crown, the people of Denmark, and we are both from the Bar of California.
The jury is advised that California is on the far reaches of the American continent. In another account by Mr. Shakespeare, one of the spectators is chased off by a bear, which is the symbol of the state of California. Counsel?
Catherine Cryer, Your Honor. I represent the Prince of Denmark, Lord Hamlet, and a member of the Bar of the State of Texas.
Your Honor, Abby Lowell, co-counsel for Prince Hamlet, member of the Bar of the District of Columbia.
Thank you, counsel. The court is pleased that you have traveled so far to be with us this evening. On the east coast of the American continent, there was a shipwreck some years ago which inspired an account by Mr. Shakespeare called The Tempest. In that play, in that account, I should say, the phrase occurs, "Brave New World," spoken by Miranda, a distant ancestor of the patron saint of defense counsel, I think. But we are here for serious matters. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as you have been instructed, and as you will be instructed once more, you are here to resolve a very narrow issue. The issue you are to resolve is the mental condition leading to the question of the criminal responsibility of the defendant, Lord Hamlet, and it's his criminal responsibility at the time of the killing of Polonius. The definition of criminal responsibility we have given you in the written instructions, and the court will instruct you in this matter as follows. There is a partnership between the court, the judge, and the jurors. The judge, on behalf of the court, instructs the jurors on questions of law, and you must accept this as given. But part of the partnership is that you will find the facts in the case, including the ultimate issue of criminal responsibility. Now, the court instructs you that a defendant is not criminally responsible for his actions if, at the time of the criminal act, in this case the killing of Polonius, if at the time of that criminal act, because of a mental disorder, he lacks substantial capacity, either to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. If you find he was not criminally responsible, he will not be tried for the act. If you find he was criminally responsible, he may be tried, he likely will be tried in a different proceeding, and you need not concern yourself with that proceeding. Now, there are two sources of evidence that you will consider in your deliberations. The first is the account of these events written by Mr. Shakespeare. It's unfortunate he's not present, so the court can thank him for his lucid and rather well-written account. But you are to consider the entire account, including all of the events and statements and actions that took place both before and after the killing of Polonius. And you can draw from that account such inferences and logical conclusions as you think appropriate, remembering again that you are the sole trier of fact. The second source of evidence that you are to consider is the evidence to be presented by the two expert witnesses who will testify, one being called by the defense, the other by the prosecution. And again, you will listen, I know, carefully to their testimony. Now, in this jurisdiction, the defense has the burden to show that Hamlet lacked criminal responsibility for his actions. That means that it's going to call the first witness. The defense has the burden of proof by what we call a preponderance of the evidence, and that is a lesser standard than beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense need to show that it was more likely than not that the defendant, Lord Hamlet, lacked the criminal responsibility for his act. And with those few opening comments, I shall now call upon the defense to present its opening argument. Ms. Cryer.
May it please the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what would you call a person who exhibits the following behaviors? Delusions, hallucinations that command murderous conduct, constant disorganized thinking, repeated bizarre behavior, and severe mood disturbance reflecting depression, fixation on suicide and death, coupled with periods of mania, overexcitement, babbling filled with puns and rhyming, and quite inappropriate hypersexual conversation. You would call that person mentally ill. Upon witnessing such conduct, even a layperson would recognize it so. A trained psychiatrist would label it more specifically with the medical term schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. Tonight in this courtroom, you will hear ample evidence of just such behavior exhibited by my client during the events surrounding the death of Polonius. The record has not been embellished. Although strange in the extreme, this is no fantasy or theater. It is word for word what actually happened during this sad time in the Kingdom of Denmark. Briefly, let me summarize what the record of his behavior will show. It is undisputed that noble Prince Hamlet was beloved within his country. A bright, gregarious young man, Hamlet had many friends, was in love with the beautiful Ophelia, and was happily pursuing his college studies at the university when a heartbreaking tragedy occurs. His father, King Hamlet, dies suddenly. Immediately thereafter, his mother marries his uncle Claudius, who ascends to the throne. Not surprisingly, the young prince falls into a depression. But it was soon clear to all that his grief was much deeper than normal sadness. In analyzing the record, you will hear Hamlet, his family and friends lament his anguish. You will hear Hamlet describe his obsession with death, his dark thoughts of suicide, his loss of appetite, his inability to sleep. This is not, as the prosecution and their expert witness will claim, a grief reaction, but the signs of classic mental disorder. Soon, his mental condition deteriorates dramatically. Among his people, superstitious when compared with modern societies, natural phenomenon could often be explained by witchcraft or spirits that roam the night. But poor Hamlet, when told that his father's ghost has been seen in the fog, does more than adopt this vision of others. He holds entire conversations with him, and most importantly, is commanded to act by the ghost. Prior to this time, Hamlet is not suspected that evil attended his father's demise. He has no thoughts of revenge for the king's death. Sad, yes, but not manic, not suicidal, and not speaking gibberish. No one but Hamlet sees the ghost except shrouded in the midnight mist. No one but Hamlet ever hears the ghost speak out and command the student prince to avenge his murder. And as his friends warn, those events cause Hamlet to literally lose his sovereignty and go mad. An intelligent, highly sensitive young man, Hamlet is tortured by this perceived mandate and painfully wrestles with the implications. Aware of the personal knowledge such danger carries with it, he tells his dear friend Horatio he will an antic disposition put on, as if appearing amusingly strange or eccentric might protect him from harm or better cloak his mental deterioration. His meager disguise includes at best a disheveled appearance, some nonsensical rhymes and responses, and his bizarre and wildly inappropriate behavior in the company of others. He hasn't a clue what other characteristics a trained psychiatrist would look for to determine whether his illness is real. He's unaware that his illusion that he controls his mania is as much a part of Hamlet's disorder as the disease itself. That schizoaffective disorder is often marked by the very claim that he is feigning, a desperate justification for his true descent into madness. In the record, you will see how horribly he behaves toward his beloved Ophelia. Far from antic, his cruel and violent madness literally drives her over the brink. Now, his mother he treats no better. In her chambers, he berates her mercilessly, he rants and raves, then sees the ghost in broad daylight while desperately claiming to be sane. Now, Queen Gertrude sees Hamlet as this, having conversations with the incorporeal air, his wild-eyed excitement, his hair literally standing on end. He can no more conform his conduct to reason, much less the law, when he whirls around in an instant and stabs through a curtain. Now, when he is confronted, his excited utterance at that moment is what? I don't know what I did. Hardly stopping to acknowledge his deed at a time when a rational man would plead insanity. Instead, Hamlet begs his mother to deem him sane. As he stands over Polonius's body, he has no appreciation for what he has done. And these are not the actions or responses of a noble prince exacting a rightful revenge, but the frenzied, disjointed ravings of a lunatic. Now, throughout the record, you will see clear evidence beyond the mere preponderance we must prove that poor Hamlet suffers the torment of a mental disorder. You will learn from renowned expert Dr. Lieberman the condition manifests itself in a young adult, that Hamlet was in every way susceptible to such a disease, that the circumstances of his birth, his age, activities, and of course the dramatic stressors he's experienced made him a prime candidate for the illness that struck him down. And you will learn that everyone who knew him best, including the two women who loved him most, never doubted he was literally out of his mind. Now, the prosecution will have you believe this was simply bereavement.
Counsel, you should conclude your remarks.
Yes, sir. However, you will see from the record that, in fact, it was mental illness. I ask only that you keep an open mind. In our enlightened society, we now understand a great deal about the human mind, a fragile organ, but we know lunacy is not occasioned by the moon, but is instead a complex condition caused by a disorder of the brain experienced by even the brightest and best among our family and friends. Hamlet will forever be punished by the nightmare that began with the murder of his father, but your verdict can ensure this tragedy is not compounded by the prosecution of this damaged soul.
Thank you, counsel.
May it please the court.
Mr. Ehrlich, we will allow you a few minutes latitude.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court, members of the jury, distinguished counsel, fellow citizens of Denmark. When Prince Hamlet heard that muffled cry for help in his mother's bedchamber, and he plunged his sword into the flesh hidden behind that tapestry, Hamlet knew he was killing a human being. He knew that killing was wrong, and he did it anyway, not because he couldn't stop himself, but because after months of agonizing deliberation, months of feigning madness to those he knew he could not trust. Hamlet had resolved, finally, that the time was right to deliver his revenge. Now, we know that that blade that Hamlet intended for his uncle Claudius found Polonius instead, and that's why we're here. But the question before you tonight is not the criminality of Hamlet's act. We're not here to debate whether Hamlet is guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, any other offense. Hamlet may even claim that he had a justification in this killing. We leave all of that for another day. The only question tonight is whether Hamlet should even have to stand trial at all and answer under the same laws that apply to the rest of us. So as you've heard from Justice Kennedy, there are really just two questions for you tonight. First, was Hamlet, at the time of the stabbing, by reason of some mental disorder, so impaired as to be incapable of understanding that killing was wrong? And second, was he, by reason of this disorder, so disabled that he was incapable of controlling his conduct and conforming it to the requirements of the law? Let me suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that you need look no further than what Hamlet said and what Hamlet did just moments before and moments after the stabbing of Polonius to know that Hamlet was fully capable of understanding and controlling his actions. So let me turn to that first question. Did Hamlet know that killing was wrong? You can begin, I think, with his reaction to the killing of his own father. He knew immediately it was wrong. He knew immediately it was criminal. Listen to what he called his uncle Claudius, the murderer. A remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain. But even more important, listen to what Hamlet says immediately after the very killing at issue tonight. He skewers Polonius to death, and then his mother Gertrude reacts in horror at his rash and bloody deed. Does Hamlet respond with gibberish, with disordered thought? No. He responds by comparing his act to the most grievous killing he knows. A bloody deed, he says, almost as bad, good mother, as kill a king and marry with his brother. And Hamlet had the presence of mind, even then, with the blood of Polonius still wet on his sword, to understand that he would one day have to answer for his crime. He says to his mother, "For this same Lord I do repent, but heaven hath pleased it so to punish me with this, and this with me." A bit later, still in the bedroom, he refers to the bleeding corpse of Polonius, and he says, "I will bestow him, and I will answer well for the death I gave him." His own words tell us that Hamlet knew and recognized immediately that he would need to repent for the wrong he had done and would someday have to answer for his crime. So let me turn to the second issue. Was Hamlet incapable of controlling his actions and stopping himself from killing? And here, ladies and gentlemen, it is hard to imagine any better evidence of self-control than the encounter between Hamlet and his uncle Claudius that occurred just moments before the killing at issue in this case. Hamlet had the perfect opportunity to kill Claudius when he came upon him kneeling in the chapel, when he was easy prey for the kill. Hamlet raised his sword, but he chose not to kill him then because he believed, as many did, that killing someone in the act of prayer would send them straight to heaven rather than hell, where Hamlet wanted him to go. When you pick and choose your time to kill, you are in control, ladies and gentlemen. And the fact that Hamlet used his sword moments later to kill Polonius through that tapestry isn't proof that he couldn't restrain himself. It's proof that he chose not to, because he believed that the time was right for revenge. Ladies and gentlemen, this strategy of feigned madness has served Hamlet well over these many years. And so it's no surprise that his attorneys have trotted it out again before us tonight. But the evidence in this case shows Hamlet not only to be a man capable of sane and rational thought, but a man capable of exquisite poetry, profound insight, careful planning, and remarkable patience, even in his grief. Whatever else you can say about Hamlet, you cannot say he was criminally insane. And at the end of this case, we will ask you to find him sane and say with your verdict that no Dane is above the law. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, we will pause for just a few minutes because there was a conveyance congestion outside and some people wish to be seated. Counsel for the defense may call the witness.
Psychiatrist Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman to the stand.
Dr. Lieberman, please stand.
Will the witness please state his name for the record?
Jeffrey Lieberman.
Please sit down, Doctor. Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Lieberman, would you please state your qualifications?
I'm a psychiatrist, board certified in clinical psychiatry. I'm chairman of psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. In my work, I've published over 400 papers in the scientific literature and authored or edited 10 books. My area of specialization is in severe mental illness, including schizophrenia, manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder, and depression. In the course of my career, I've treated thousands of such patients. And in order to keep my clinical skills sharp, I see patients to this very day.
Doctor, there's a record containing Hamlet's thoughts, actions, behaviors. Have you had an opportunity to review that record?
The record provides a rich and detailed account of Hamlet's behavior through his external actions and his words, but also a window into his mind through his thoughts. It's clear from the record that this should not be looked at as a dramatic work of art or a fiction. Because when one goes to a movie or a play or reads a book, one suspends disbelief. So when I sat down to review this record, I viewed it from a clinical perspective in the cold light of everyday reality, albeit of the 17th century.
And without reflecting, almost in hindsight, were you able to review it chronologically, and is that important?
It's very important because a mental illness follows a natural history and expresses itself or presents itself in stages.
Now, do you believe that Hamlet suffered from a mental illness?
Hamlet's behavior was unquestionably abnormal and deranged in terms of having what in layman's terms is called a nervous breakdown. He experienced severe swings of mood and also a break with reality. He lost touch with reality. In medical terms, it is called schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, and that is diagnosis 295.7 in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association.
Could you please explain what schizoaffective disorder bipolar type is?
It's a combination of symptoms from schizophrenia and manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder, including psychosis, meaning hallucinations, which are false perceptions such as hearing voices, delusions, which are false beliefs or exaggerated beliefs, disorganized thinking, and bizarre behavior. And mood symptoms, which in the case of a bipolar type, oscillate between those of depression, meaning sadness, feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, disturbance in sleeping, and loss of appetite, and those of mania, meaning excitation, grandiosity, pressured speech, flights of idea, and irritability.
Would you consider the characteristics of ambivalence and indecision in that diagnosis?
Ambivalence is one of the cardinal symptoms of psychosis, and what it reflects is what it reflects is a paralysis of will, which leads to an inability to take action or to make a decision because there are conflicting motives that affect the individual. In addition, another aspect of schizoaffective disorder is unfortunately feeling that life is not worth living and that suicide might be a good alternative. And occasionally, this violent, self-destructive feeling is turned outward and it can result in harmful feelings towards other people as well.
Very importantly, Doctor, on what evidence in the record do you base your diagnosis?
Well, this young man is in the precise period of risk for which schizoaffective disorder manifests itself, which is late adolescence and early adulthood. And in addition, he experiences a series of stressful life events which trigger the onset of the illness. So he's away at university in Wittenberg, outside of the protective environment of his home and family and the doting, watchful eye of his mother for the first time. He learns of his father's unexpected death. He returns home for the funeral and finds that his mother is about to marry his uncle immediately. So he's observed by all to be very distressed and sad, melancholy. The queen comments, "Good Hamlet, cast thy nighted color off." The king observes, "O impious stubbornness, 'tis unmanly grief." Hamlet, in one of his first speeches, gives a classic description of melancholia. He says, "I have of late lost all my mirth, foregone all custom of exercises, and indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory, this most excellent canopy. The air, why it appeareth nothing to me but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors." And then he reveals feelings of suicidal thoughts, where he says, "Oh, that to this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw and resolve itself into dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter." So he begins to show depression, which is observed by all and described by him. But then his condition worsens. He joins his friends on the castle ramparts to view this apparition they've seen in the dead of night, in the fog and mist, and he encounters this apparition as a ghost in which he visually and auditorily hallucinates. He goes off with this hallucination, this ghost, and he experiences a revelation that he elaborates into a delusion that his father didn't die but was murdered by his uncle, and he's commanded to avenge this murder. This is what's called a command hallucination, which is one of the most ominous psychopathologic features in psychosis, and frequently, when encountered in a clinical setting, warrants hospitalization of the individual if it involves violence. Now, Hamlet, after encountering the ghost, is visibly distraught, and he comes back to his friends, and he attempts to act completely indifferent to this, which really is surprising to them. They say, Horatio says, "What news, my lord?" And Hamlet replies, "Oh, everything's wonderful." And he goes on as if there's nothing wrong. And in the exchange, this to his friends, who are very concerned about him, makes no sense, prompting Horatio to say, "These are but wild and whirling words, my lord." And then, "O day and night, but this is wondrous strange." So Hamlet who previously was depressed, melancholy, has now become bizarre and disorganized in his thinking. Ophelia, in commenting on this, says, Lord Hamlet, with his doublet all unbraided, no hat upon his head, his stockings fouled, ungartered and down jived to his ankle, as if he had been loosed out of hell. Polonius more succinctly describes his condition in talking to the king and queen by saying, I will be brief, your noble son is mad. Indeed, all the people, all the characters in the play think he's mad at this point.
All right, Doctor, with time is of the essence, can you describe the course of this illness?
Well, the course of his illness is classic manifestations of the stages of schizoaffective disorder, and Polonius very accurately describes it. He says, and he fell into a sadness, then into a fast, thence to a watch, thence to a weakness, thence to lightness, and by this declension into madness, wherein now he raves. So Hamlet has progressed from a state of melancholy and depression to psychosis, to then mania, which is characteristic of schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. In the context of his manic phase, though, he becomes abusive and impulsive, and it's this that leads him to the bedroom scene where the murder is committed. In the play that he orchestrates for the court, he acts completely outlandishly and sexually suggestively and inappropriately. After the play, because he's embarrassed the queen, she summons him to his chamber. On the way, he passes the king praying in the chapel, and he thinks, this is my chance. But yet again, he can't act on it. Since the ghost has revealed the murder, he's wanted to kill the king, but he hasn't been able to, despite numerous opportunities. Here, he passes them. They're all alone. He has a great opportunity. What happens? He is again paralyzed in inaction by his ambivalence. He rationalizes it at praying, but that's the way this expresses itself, through rationalization. He finally enters the bedchamber, and he's in a psychotic fury and a manic frenzy. He threatens his mother. She says, cries out, what wilt thou do? Wilt thou murder me? Help ho. Polonius hears this and starts, and he makes a noise. Hamlet hears this, and like a startled animal, without thinking, whirls around, thrusts his rapier through the curtain, and stabs and kills Polonius. The mother says, O me, what hast thou done? Hamlet says, nay, I know not. Is it the king? So Hamlet is like a combat veteran who has PTSD and reacted to a sound. And he doesn't know. He then, after the fact, inferentially constructs, I'm in the king's bedroom, somebody made a noise behind the curtain, I thrust, it must have been the king. But he doesn't know. He shows no remorse. He returns to upbraiding his mother, and she says, alas, he's mad. He's hallucinating now, communicates with the ghost. The queen doesn't see it. She says, whereupon do you look? Hamlet replies, on him, look how pale he glares. The queen says, to whom do you speak this? He says, do you see nothing there? The queen says, nothing at all, yet all that is I see. And here, the queen makes the accurate diagnosis as only a mother who knows her child can do. This is the very coinage of your brain. So she knows this is a disorder in his brain that is causing him to act thus. The diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder is defined by the presence of psychosis and severe mood disturbance, and there's abundant evidence for this in the record.
Doctor, I wish to reserve a minute or so let me ask you one final question on direct. Could Hamlet distinguish right from wrong or control himself when he killed Polonius?
I don't believe so, because he was in the throes of his psychosis, and the state of mind of a psychotic individual is such they cannot distinguish their internal reality from external reality. We've seen this time and time again with psychotic killers who have been described in the media. A very good example is not a killer, but a victim, Andrea Yates, who recently, in the throes of a postpartum psychosis, killed her 2 children, the most precious things in the world. Why? Because she believed they were instruments of the devil, because of the delusions and the command hallucinations she was having. Hamlet faced the same challenge.
Thank you.
Well, counsel for the prosecution is coming. I have just one question or 2 questions, Doctor. You have treated people with auditory hallucinations.
Yes.
You have to answer yes for
Yes.
the record.
Yes, Your Honor.
And for these patients, those hallucinations, those auditory hallucinations, are very real and very terrifying
They're as real as your voice is being perceived by me.
and terrifying.
They are as terrifying as your voice is for me.
Thank you. Feel free to ask any more, Your Honor. Dr. Lieberman, I want to see if I can clarify something about this schizoaffective disorder. Even if a person actually has this disorder, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't keep themselves from stabbing other people.
That's true.
And so you're not suggesting that everyone with schizoaffective disorder should be locked away in an institution?
Well, whether they're hospitalized in that is a matter of their gravity of their clinical condition, whether they're a potential harm to themselves or others, and it's really a clinical situation of how you manage the case.
And you're not suggesting that everyone with schizoaffective disorder is incapable of understanding that killing is wrong, are you?
No.
Okay. It all depends, right?
It depends on the severity of the symptoms and the nature of their condition.
Right, and one of the ways to determine the severity of the symptoms and the nature of that condition at the time in question is to examine their actions at the time,
Yes.
to examine the way they communicate,
And their mental status.
and to examine the things they say.
To examine all aspects of their behavior and their mental functioning, including trying to obtain information from other people who have observed the person and can provide additional history.
The question was, would you examine the things the patient says?
Of course.
Now, I want to start by drawing your attention to that moment you mentioned briefly, where Hamlet encounters Claudius while he's making his way to his mother's bedroom. You are familiar with that scene?
Yes, I am. I've read it a number of times in preparation for this,
Now,
this proceeding.
and just a few pages earlier in the record, Hamlet had said, "Now could I drink hot blood and do such business as the bitter day would quake to look on." You remember him saying that?
Yes, I do very well.
Would you agree these are words of anger?
Unquestionably, anger.
And words of somebody resolved to take action?
Words of somebody who would like to take action, but whether he is capable of taking action remains to be determined.
And these words that Hamlet spoke occurred right after he had caught the king's conscience with his play. Is that correct?
Well, he observed the king in viewing the play that he had arranged for the court. The king's reaction is one of standing up and deciding to leave the room. Hamlet observes this, and he perceives this as some incriminating look that allows him to fix the delusion that previously was a suspicion.
And that was that's the way Hamlet perceived it.
That's right.
And from that perception, he resolved to act, correct? With his words.
I believe that he resolved to act probably earlier. It probably began on the castle ramparts when he first had the revelation through either his experience with a ghost or through his auditory hallucination that his father had been murdered.
Well, let me ask you about that scene.
Which scene?
He's on his way to visit his mother. He sees Claudius from behind, and Claudius is alone, correct?
Yes.
Claudius is on his knees.
Yes.
Hamlet is also alone, yes?
Yes. It's with him and his voices.
Hamlet Claudius doesn't see Hamlet, does he?
Not as far as you can tell from the record.
And Hamlet has his sword on him.
Yes, he does.
And Hamlet says, "And now I'll do it," doesn't he?
Yes.
Hamlet takes out his sword. That's in the record, correct?
Yes.
He starts moving towards Claudius.
Yes.
But then Hamlet stops himself, right?
That's right.
He lowers his arm.
Yes.
He puts his sword back in its sheath.
Yes.
No one else had appeared on the scene to intervene, correct?
That's right.
No palace guards had come to restrain Hamlet.
No.
He made that decision himself, didn't he?
Yes.
He made it based on the functioning of his own brain.
Well, neurophysiologically speaking, I don't know that you could say it's
Did he
related.
use his brain to make that decision, Doctor?
He decided not to kill him then.
Okay. And he put away his sword because of a belief he had about cause and effect. Is that right?
Ostensibly, you could see it that way, but as I've tried to indicate, he has had the idea to kill Claudius from early on, and he's had a number of opportunities because he's been in situations where he's been with the king. He has not been able to do it, and I'm characterizing the inability, including at the scene that you're describing, as due to this inability, this
Doctor,
paralysis.
excuse me, I understand your characterization. I want to ask you about the facts in the record, and I want to ask you if it's correct. Did Hamlet choose not to kill Claudius at this time because he didn't want to send him to heaven?
That was his rationalization.
And these were his words: "Up, sword, and know thou a more horrid hint, when he is drunk, asleep, or in his rage, or in the incestuous pleasure of his bed, at game a-swearing, or about some act that has no relish of salvation in it. Then trip him, that his heels may kick at heaven, and that his soul may be as damned and black as hell whereto it goes." Those were Hamlet's words, weren't they?
That's an accurate quotation. But how many times have you
And,
seen...
and Hamlet,
How
Doc,
many-
we have limited time, I'm sorry. How many...
How many times have you seen someone want to do something, not be able to do it, and then say, oh, I really couldn't do it, or I really decided I didn't want to do that? This is what ambivalence is, and this is a classic feature of this illness. People have to make explanations and provide excuses, or else it is a humiliating and demeaning experience because they realize how powerless they are.
And Doctor, Hamlet was able to resolve that ambivalence towards his action just moments later when he heard the cry from behind the tapestry.
Not
correct?
at all. I don't agree. I don't
Okay.
agree.
Let me ask you, is it correct that this time when Hamlet drew his sword, he used it?
Yes.
Okay. Now, it's true also that Hamlet and his mother were arguing with each other. They had a vigorous argument in
That's right. That's
in
right.
that scene. And in fact, before visiting his mother, Hamlet had said he would speak daggers to Gertrude, but would use none. Remember that?
And he had been admonished by the ghost, his voice, not to touch his mother, to leave her to heaven.
And he was able to control himself, wasn't he, by refraining from touching his mother.
He had been commanded to by the ghost. This is a command hallucination.
He had a sword on him, but he didn't raise it against his mother, did he?
Well, he threw her on the bed.
He didn't strike her with his fists.
Well, if Polonius didn't intervene, we don't know what might have happened, but I don't think he would have either.
Now, Doctor, can you pinpoint for us in the record precisely when Hamlet first started manifesting these symptoms of schizoaffective disorder?
Well, that's difficult to do because I don't have the pre-morbid history or the history of his behavior prior to the record of the play.
Well, when can you conclude, based on what you have, that Hamlet had this disorder, which you've described?
Well, it looks like it occurred very soon after he returned to Elsinore from Wittenberg. 'Cause
Okay.
he was exhibiting symptoms of depression.
And now, one of the characteristic symptoms you've described is disorganized speech. Is that correct?
Yes, disorganized thinking and incoherent speech.
Now, are you familiar with that moment in the record where Hamlet begins to talk to himself and uses the words "to be" or "not to be"? That is the question. Are you familiar with that?
I'm abundantly familiar with it.
You'd agree that line is fairly well put.
I would say that soliloquy is not only well put, it is the most eloquent expression of ambivalence in the history of the English language.
And Doctor, you know then that soliloquy of 35 lines that is "to be" or "not to be." I want to ask you, which of those lines do you believe to be the product of a psychotic mind?
The lines that he says are a description of his ambivalence, which is that to be or not to be, to live or to die, to take up the arms against the slings and arrows of outrageous, to be active, assertive, or simply be passive and just go along with the throes of fortune. He's expressing, he's giving verbal expression to his mental psychopathologic feature. We all have degrees of ambivalence. Justice Kennedy described the legal profession as having a particular proclivity to this, but it's something we can But this is something we can overcome. Hamlet is parallel.
Doctor, let me move on. You have described this encounter with the ghost as a hallucination. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that Hamlet saw and spoke to the ghost on only one occasion before he killed Polonius, correct?
No, he had numerous occasions where he communicated with a ghost.
He had numerous occasions where he communicated with the ghost after that first time he encountered the ghost on the castle walls?
Yes.
Okay. In fact, sir, the second time that the ghost appeared to Hamlet wasn't until after he killed Polonius. You do not agree with that?
No, that's not so. He had the scene where he was communicating with the ghost on the ramparts. Then when he returned and he was talking to his friends, while he was trying to first tell them nothing was wrong and then swearing them to secrecy, the ghost was imploring him to swear, don't say anything.
And in fact, sir, a hallucination is something that is a false perception, such that a sick person would see it and perceive it, but a healthy person would not.
That's right.
And Hamlet wasn't the only one in the record to see this ghost, was he?
Well, you're talking about the guards, the sentinels seeing him on the ramparts, the ghost?
Indeed.
Well, that's true. Now, the way I would understand
My question...
well, no.
The question is, he wasn't the only one to see him. Bernardo saw him, one of the guards, who saw the ghost of Hamlet's father, correct?
On the
Marcellus,
ramparts,
is that correct or incorrect, sir?
they saw an apparition that characterized as a ghost.
Marcellus?
You can answer the question, and then you can explain your answer briefly.
Yes.
Okay. And all three of these men heard the ghost speak, as you just said, when the ghost made them swear on the sword.
Nobody heard them speak. Only Hamlet heard them speak. The only experience any character in the play other than Hamlet had of the ghost was to see the ghost in this apparition form on the ramparts in that initial scene. No, the sentinels, nor anyone else in the play ever heard the ghost or engaged in anything with the ghost.
Dr. Lieber, you were one of the contributors to the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
In a manner of speaking.
And you do regard it as an authoritative source on psychiatric diagnosis?
The Bible.
The Bible? But you are aware, doctor, that the DSM-4 warns specifically that in certain cultures, being visited by the spirit of a dead relative should not be considered a manifestation of a psychotic disorder. Is that true or false?
That is true, but that's not the case in Denmark.
And that is... now, you've said that Hamlet was delusional.
Yes.
And I want to talk to you about and a delusion is a false belief.
That's right.
I want to talk to you about some of Hamlet's
false
beliefs.
or exaggerated belief.
I want to talk to you about some of his beliefs very quickly. Hamlet believed that Claudius had killed his father, right?
Yes.
That was true.
Yes.
Hamlet believed that he might be in danger if Claudius discovered that Hamlet knew the truth, correct?
That's true.
Hamlet believed he was under surveillance from the very beginning, didn't he?
He was paranoid.
In fact, sometimes just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you're not being watched.
You're absolutely right, Counselor.
And in fact, let's count how many were spying on Hamlet. Claudius, Polonius, Ophelia willingly used herself as a pawn in the spying.
I don't know how willingly she did. Her father was a very controlling individual.
Hamlet's own mother, Gertrude, along with Claudius, hired his schoolboy friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to spy on him, correct?
There was a lot of intrigue in the court of Denmark.
So Hamlet believed that, and again, it was true. As they say around this town, Hamlet did a pretty good job of connecting the dots.
Well, in retrospect, it would look like that, but I would submit to you, if you're looking at the record from the perspective of a clinical psychiatrist without the knowledge of what the ultimate conclusion is, the probability that these all connected up to be a plot such as this, where he orchestrated and outlandishly conducted a revenge scheme in this way, are very, very slim. I would say that if you construe them that way, it's because you're thinking this is a detective film as opposed to a clinical record.
Hamlet said early on that he would feign madness, didn't he? And did he or did he not, sir?
Well, he said several things to that effect, such as to put on antic disposition.
And that was an effort to say, I may act crazy in the future, correct?
Well, I regard antic disposition as that I'm going to act silly and funny.
And he did
and his behavior went way beyond silly and funny.
Well, he acted crazy or silly and funny around only those who he knew were spying on him. Isn't that correct?
He acted that way around everybody, except Horatio.
Okay. And Horatio is the one man he trusted.
Which is often the case with psychotic individuals. They're able to invest trust in a single person. This is a phenomenon that often is migrating from individual to individual, but this is a very common feature.
Now, Dr. Lieberman, you're familiar with Dr. Stone?
Yes.
Do you think that, are you familiar with his contributions to the field of psychiatry?
Absolutely. Alan Stone is one of the giants of American psychiatry.
And it's not uncommon in your profession for patients to seek a second opinion, is it?
And the third and the fourth.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Lieberman, I think about individuals like David Berkowitz, Theodore Kaczynski, maybe Andrea Yates. Can people at times appear to be lucid and rational that are suffering from severe mental illness?
Yes, it's anybody who is examined or is knowledgeable about people with psychotic disorders know that their psychosis is not affecting their behavior on a continuous linear fashion, but that it waxes and wanes. David Berkowitz, the example you mentioned, was somebody who terrorized New York City from 1975 to 1977, committing murders at the behest of his hallucinations. His dog, who we called Son of Sam, would command him to kill women with long hair. During that 2-year period, before he was apprehended, he held down a job, he lived at home with his mother, and he went about his daily life without attracting attention to people that he was clearly acting unusually strange and needed to be treated or incarcerated.
There are individuals that may see apparitions, may see dead relatives, but in any community, what would you consider one who gets command hallucinations from such a relative to commit murder?
Well, the nature of Hamlet's hallucinations go well beyond those of somebody who's having a complicated grief reaction. Usually that takes the form of hearing your voice repeatedly called or having the thought of somebody or the image of somebody. Hamlet is having a dialogue. He's engaging in behavior that is instructed by the ghost. So this is not something which I would regard as a cultural phenomenon or even something that is an aspect of his bereavement.
Counsel mentioned that he was using his brain to make decisions. I assume we all do so. There may be other parts that decide for us, but in fact, can a diseased mind be directing those decisions?
Absolutely.
And finally, is there any other more accurate and plausible explanation, sir, for Hamlet's behavior in this record than the disease and disorder you have described?
I think that the most plausible and accurate explanation is that he suffered from a mental illness, and the mental illness that he fits best is schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, and that as a result of that, he did not know what he was doing, and he was not able to control himself. This is a young man who needs treatment, not to be tried.
Thank you, Dr. Lieberman. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Dr. Lieberman. You may step down. Counsel for the prosecution may call its expert witness.
Yes, Your Honor, we would call Dr. Alan Stone.
Dr. Stone.
Will the witness please state his name for the record?
Alan Stone.
Good evening, Dr. Stone.
Evening.
Dr. Stone, can you tell us your current occupation?
Yes, I'm the Turoff Gluck Professor of Law and Psychiatry in the Faculty of Law and the Faculty of Medicine at Harvard University.
What other positions have you held which bear on your expertise in this matter?
I've been the president of the American Psychiatric Association, and I helped formulate the American Psychiatric Association's position on the insanity defense.
In addition to your work at Harvard, are you also a film critic?
I am, indeed. Wait, this is a plug.
Have you written on the subject of film?
Yes, I have a new book coming out. MIT Press. Film and the Moral Adventure of Life.
Do you teach courses at Harvard that are relevant to the trial of Hamlet?
I do. I teach a course in law and psychiatry at the law school, which deals with the insanity defense, and I teach a course in law and literature in which Hamlet is one of the most important texts.
And what about books particularly relevant to this trial?
Yes, my book, Law, Psychiatry, and Morality, has a section which deals with the insanity defense. And my book, The Abnormal Personality Through Literature, deals with characters like Hamlet in literature.
Did you put Hamlet in your book on the abnormal personality in literature?
No, Hamlet didn't make the grade. Hamlet is not an example of a clear mental illness. This is a book that was read by college students, by high school students, and by medical students, and I didn't think that Hamlet was a clear example for them to learn from.
Dr. Stone, in your professional, it's been called, in fact, a giant opinion in the world of psychiatry, did Hamlet have hallucinations?
No, I would say Hamlet did not have hallucinations. And I would disagree with the question, the way my colleague answered it, and he is also a giant in psychiatry.
And a very gracious expert, I must add, you are.
And I would say that it is very important to take people's cultural and religious beliefs into account. So the American Psychiatric Association is very concerned, for example, that a born-again Christian who says that he feels Jesus come into his heart, or he hears the voice of Jesus speak to him, which many born-again Christians do, that a psychiatrist would proceed on the theory that that person is having hallucinations. So I think Hamlet is in much that situation. I think his friend Horatio, the person he trusts, and who I must say I find an admirable human being as well, Horatio did not believe that this apparition was real until he saw it with his own eyes. And if you will remember the text, Hamlet doesn't believe it either, and he questions them until he sees it with his own eyes. So I think that we in Denmark accept the fact that there are ghosts. And I accept that we have skepticism, but when we see it with our own eyes, we believe it.
Dr. Stone, what about delusions? Did Hamlet have delusions?
So, delusions, as you've heard, are false ideas. But every idea that Hamlet had, we now know is true. We know that Claudius confessed to killing his father. We know that Claudius induced his mother to marry him, and that way to push Hamlet out of his position to become king of Denmark. We know that he was spied on. We know that Polonius, in particular, was spying on him and pushed his daughter into spying on him. So there's not a single idea that Hamlet had which is a false idea. There's no false belief, there's no exaggerated belief, there's no bizarre beliefs. Everything Hamlet said, all in Denmark know now, was exactly the truth of the matter. So he does not have hallucinations, he does not have delusions.
And what about thought disorganization or thought disorder?
Hundreds of people, thousands of people, have studied Hamlet's thoughts. Abraham Lincoln studied Hamlet's thoughts. Frederick Douglass studied Hamlet's thoughts. Lincoln and Douglass quoted Hamlet to each other, not because they were the ravings of a madman, but because they thought they were some of the most brilliant thoughts that any human being in the history of the Western civilization had ever had. I share that view with them. I think it is totally bizarre to call Hamlet's thoughts disorganized. So I do not think he has disorganized thoughts.
So, Dr. Stone, it seems that you believe that Hamlet showed none of the schizo part of schizophrenic systems. Is that right?
Exactly. He had neither hallucinations, nor delusions, nor thought disorder.
And what about the affective side of the bipolar disorder? And I'm sorry that I can't give it to you with the decimal point that the opposing doctor used. But what about the affective side of bipolar disorder?
So we've just discussed what is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the A criterion to make the diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. And I suggest that any fair reading of the text would show that Hamlet has none of those symptoms. So now we turn to, was he depressed? Well, I would say he came very close to being depressed. He was heartbroken about the death of his father, and he was repelled by the thought that his mother had married his uncle, whom he despised. And so Hamlet did despise people. He was a man of passion. So he was, I would say, having a complicated grief reaction, a complicated bereavement that a person in that situation would have, that I think any of us would have if our father suddenly died and our mother married the uncle within weeks.
So depression then does not mean to you doesn't know what he's doing, can't control his actions.
No, I think when he says that this too solid flesh should melt and thaw itself into a dew, I think he is feeling grief. He's a passionate human being. He feels real grief. But he's not somebody who's depressed, who's going over and over the same thoughts. He's constantly filled with interesting, amazing ideas.
And what about to be or not to be?
So Abraham Lincoln thought to be or not to be was not a suicide note. Kierkegaard thought it was not a suicide note. Nietzsche did not think it was a suicide note, and I do not think it was a suicide note.
What do you think it is?
I think why Kierkegaard appreciated it so much because it was an appreciation of the existential predicament of humanity 400 years before they had the ideas that shaped our civilization. The struggle between accepting the world as it is and faith in something more. And so that is an incredibly brilliant, prodigious work of genius, that speech.
How do you respond to, if I can summarize the opposing doctor's point of view, that all Hamlet is a picture